Yud Gimel Amud Beis. Gentlemen, let's just get back into this. We're actually at the last part of the Gemara, the last few lines, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just to get back into this, let me tell you what's going on. We're back into beans. No, exactly. We're good. We didn't talk about this last week with Kitnius, and some people may not have liked it, but some Kitnius on Pesach. But we're back to beans. So let me just tell you what's happening here. If you remember from the previous weeks, we've got a couple of the rules go as follows. When is the cutoff point for the year for taking Trumas and Maestras? Because one cannot take from one year across to another. In fact, there's a possibly named Shona b'Shona. 1 year, you take the fruits or the vegetables from 1 year, and you take your Trumas and Maestras from that year's crop, then you move on to another year. So, what is the cutoff point? We've learned before. When it comes to trees, remember it's the budding of the fruits. Which reminds me, I've mentioned this before, please get out there if you can to see some fruit trees budding, or actually there you just need the blossom. That's what you're looking for. If you get a chance, lovely bracha to make. Nice to make it in the month of Nisan, but you don't have to. So anyway, when it comes to trees, the cutoff point is budding. When it comes to Tavua, which remember was crops, we're talking about grain, oil, and there it's when it's grown a third of its growth. That must happen prior to Rosh Hashanah. If it happens prior to the Rosh Hashanah, it's last year's crop. Vegetables, we spoke about lekita, when they're plucked, which basically means when they're ready, when they're nigma, when they're finished. It's the finished product when they're plucked. If that plucking takes place prior to Rosh Hashanah, last year's crop, post our Rosh Hashanah, next year's crop, kept separate. And then we spoke about these small, as we said here, the kitnios, these beans, different types of beans, nothing to do with Heinz, but just beans. Well, it could be. But if they're beans, remember we spoke there's a different cutoff point, and that's where it takes root. And if you remember, we had the principle last week, which was Reb Shimon Shazuri. Reb Shimon Shazuri, what happens if you have beans, last year's crop and next year's crop? Remember, going across the year, Reb Shimon Shazuri says, don't worry about it, because what you can do with these beans is you can mix them up as well as you can. They're small beans. Mix them up, bring them to the central point wherever your storehouse is, mix them well, and then when you take your truma, imagine you're taking, let's say, a mice, keep it easy in the numbers, you're taking 1/10 of the crop. When you take 1/10 of the crop, they will be mixed in the proportion of last year's and next year's. You remember? We spoke, for example, remember you had 9, I don't know, bushels. Well, no, actually, when whatever we're talking about a volume, whatever volume you like, but 9 and 1 volume of next year's crop. So it's a 9-to-1, 9 from last year and 1. It could be a volume, whatever volume you like, liters or gallons or whatever volume you're talking about. If they're in the proportion 9-to-1, if you mix them up very well, in fact, probably a better word will be blend, which will back now to whiskey. If you blending these items together, the beans, or mixing the beans together, when you take 1/10 of that, imagine you've got 9-1, you take 1/10. If you mix them well, then of course, because they are small beans, you'd expect to take them, it's what's called yesh bila. You can mix, and we can assume that you've done a good job in your mixing, and therefore when you take 1/10, you will be taking 1/10 according to those two proportions. So again, according to Reb Shimon Shazuri, because he is of the opinion that yesh bilo means mixing, livlol, to mix, belula. Of course, if liquids, we're talking there about a blending. Of course, you can understand you can do that with liquids, with wines or whiskies. If you'd mix two, imagine a barrel of wine, last year's and next year's crop. Of course, if you mix it well, and then eventually when you take whatever you take from it, will be in the proportions that you place them in the barrel. Says Reb Shimon Shazuri, the same principle of blending or mixing applies to small beans, and therefore if you have last year's crop and this year's crop, put them all together, do a great mix. Then when you take out the crop, it will be mixed in the correct proportions. Are you with me? You've got 9 from last year, 1 from this year. Put them all together, you've now got 10, whatever the volume is, but imagine there, 9 of one and 1 of the other. Mix them together, you've now got 10. When you take a tenth, one, whatever the volume is that you're taking, you with me? It will be in the proportions 9 to 1. Is that clear or not clear? Yeah. Any thumbs up from people? Yeah. So in other words, if they're mixed well, says Shimon Shazuri, don't worry about last year's crop and next year's crop, which we normally want to keep separate. You are taking them in the proportions that they've been mixed, because they are small beans, and small beans therefore mix well, and therefore when you take your the volume of 1, assuming it was a 9 to 1 arrangement, then it will be in the proportions 9 to 1 because they are well mixed and very small items. Now we pick this up.
So why is that all right? You've got from the Yoshon, you've got Yoshon and Chodesh mixed together. The fact that they're well mixed doesn't. I don't see how that gets you out of the.
Okay, start again. You mustn't mix Yoshon and Chodesh.
Understand.
Right? We've got to keep them separate. If, however, they're imagine, okay, let's go to liquids. Imagine you had 10 liters of last year's wine and 1 liter of next year's wine. Yeah?
No.
Take them separate. We don't really want to mix. If you mix them both together and put them now in one big barrel containing 10 liters, let's say, of wine, when you take a tenth, it will be in the right proportion of a 9 to 1. So therefore, you're actually you're taking your new crop and you'll say, whatever I've got in there, 9 goes to my old crop, 1 goes to my new crop. That's wine. So that's very easy to see this blending. Yeah. Similarly, said Reb Shimon Shazuri, I allow you to do the same thing with beans. And I'm assuming that you know how to mix these beans up very well. And then when you take your tenth of those beans, they will be in the proportion of last year's and next year's. It's true, you can't differentiate, assuming they both look the same. You couldn't differentiate in your 2 wines, assuming they're both the same. But you've done the job. You are actually taking from last year's crop. You're taking your 9, and I'm taking my 1 from next year's crop. So that's fine. You can't do that very easily if you've got larger items. If you had fruit, even if
you're doing the 2 mitzvahs together. So you're doing
correct.
2 processes of mitzvah. Okay, I'm with you now.
That is only Shimon Shazuri who allows you to do that, because he says, we rely that you've done a good mixing job, and you can do that with very small items. When they get larger, it gets much trickier, and therefore that's clean. Even Shimon Shazuri would not allow you to do this, because there's no way of telling, we went into this last time, that you've actually, when you've taken your 1, it's actually mixed in the right proportions, because if they're larger items, large apples, who says you've actually got exactly a 9 to 1 split? Yeah, you with me? If they're larger apples, if you're mixing them together, it's very tricky to ensure you've got the proportions 9:1. But if it's liquids, or indeed, if we're talking here about these small beans, you can assume you've done a good mixing job, according to Reb Shimon Shazuri. The Chachomim disagree with Reb Shimon Shazuri. We therefore pick this up 6 lines up from the end of Yud Gimel Amud Beis. Omer Rab Yitzchok bar Nachmani Omer Shmuel. So this is Shmuel saying the following statement, that the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur. That was the person we mentioned last time. He actually made this statement in the name of Reb Shimon Shazuri. So that's it. It's a Tana called Reb Shimon Shazuri, and he's saying the halacha is like this Reb Shimon Shazuri that we mentioned last time, the blending and the mixing. Says the Gemara that Shmuel is paskening like Reb Shimon Shazuri. Remember, we're talking about the beans, we're talking about the mixing. We spoke, if you're mixing, imagine it's after Rosh Hashanah is the cutoff point. You've mixed them from before Rosh Hashanah to after Rosh Hashanah. Don't worry, you can mix and that's fine. Says Rab Zera, Maskif lo Rab Zera. Rab Zera asks, Maskif is normally very strong questions, a skafta, a strong question. And what's the strong question? It's a contradiction in the halacha of Shmuel. Why? Umi, 3 lines up, Umi Oma Shmuel Hochi. Did Shmuel really say this? That what? That the halacha is like Reb Shimon Shazuri? Because he says, I've got another statement from Shmuel. Got a contradiction now. V'ha'oma Shmuel. Shmuel made a statement. La koil ein bila. Mixing, we do not allow you to mix and then assume you've taken in the right proportions. Chutz, miyayin, v'shemen, wine, oil. In other words, liquids, we can do a good blending. Yeah? Remember the example again? 9 liters from last year's crop. 1 liter from this year's crop. You mix them all together, put them in a barrel. Clearly, when you take your 1 liter, which is a tenth, it will be 9/10 of old, 1/10 of new. So as we said before, you're taking now your maisa in one go. You're capturing a 9/10 from last year, 1/10. That's because it's a liquid. That seems to contradict paskening like Reb Shimon Shazuri. You with me? We've started off with Rab Yitzchok bar Nachmani telling us the halacha is like Shmuel, that we pasken like Reb Shimon Shazuri, the person we mentioned last time, who spoke about the mixing with beans. Says Rab Zera, that's very nice, Reb Shimon Shazuri, but you can't have Shmuel paskening like him. Why not? Because Shmuel is known to have said that we allow this blending and mixing with liquids, wine, oil, when you take a trumas and maisros, but not beans. We've got a problem here. Can the real Shmuel stand up, please, and tell us how he's paskening? You're telling me, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani, that Shmuel paskens like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, and we're learning over here that Shmuel says that blending and mixing applies to liquids and liquids alone, but not beans. That's a question he asks him. Maskif lo Rab Zera. The reply back in a nice, gentle way would be, Ishtamitze, he's forgotten. Nice reply. A question's raised and you point your finger and you say, you've forgotten another statement of Shmuel. This is against Reb Zera. What does that mean? Ishtamitze hoda oma Shmuel. There's a third statement of Shmuel, which says, Hakol holech acha gemar pri. Everything follows, when you're talking about these beans, the end of their growth. What does that mean? It means when they're plucked, when the end of the growth, as opposed to, we were learning previously that when you speak about beans, it's when they take root. And therefore, if they took root before Rosh Hashanah or after Rosh Hashanah, there'll be a problem. I've got last year's crop and next year's crop. Says Shmuel a third statement, and we're going to have to put these three statements together and see what we get from this. We do not follow when they take root. We take when they're actually plucked. What does that mean? Have a look at Rashi, 4 lines up. So we've got 3 statements, if you remember, of Shmuel. He paskins like Reb Shimon Shazuri. He says blending applies to liquids. And he says when you're talking about these kitnios, these beans, the same as other vegetables. Have a look at 3 lines up in Rashi. Av ha-kitnios lo holchu bohen acha hashrosha. You do not follow the principle when they took roots, but when they're plucked, the ending of their growth. What does that mean? So therefore, it follows, as Rashi will tell us, when Shmuel made this statement, the halachas like Reb Shimon Shazuri, what did Reb Shimon Shazuri say? He said, if you have a crop which took root prior to Rosh Hashanah, these are beans, and you've got beans which took root after Rosh Hashanah, you can put them all together in the middle of this storehouse or wherever you're keeping them, mix them, and take your maisa from them. Shmuel agrees to him, but for a different reason. Look at this Rashi, 2 lines up. When Shmuel says the halachas like Reb Shimon, Shazuri, lo mitamei ka'omar. It's for a different reason. Reb Shimon Shazuri said, place them all in the middle, mix them, and take your trumas amaisrus. De'ilu Reb Shimon Shazuri, what was the reason why Reb Shimon Shazuri allowed you to do that? Tameh, his reason was mishum bila, because of blending and mixing. He says you can mix them all together, and therefore when you take your trumas, imagine back to these beans, these a volume, when you take your volume of beans, they will be in the correct proportions, 9:1 in my example. Shmuel says you can do that, but not because of Reb Shimon Shazuri's reason. If they took root prior to Rosh Hashanah, and some took root after Rosh Hashanah, when are they finished? They've all grown, they took root. When you actually went to take the crop, they are all considered 1 year's crop. Because they grow to their full growth after Rosh Hashanah, they are therefore considered next year's crop. So again, Reb Shimon Shazuri said, when you have beans which took root prior to Rosh Hashanah, you've got other beans which took root after Rosh Hashanah, take them all together and take your trumas and maisros from all of them together. Reb Shimon Shazuri, what real reason was, because when you mix them all together, this blending or mixing, you're taking them in the right proportions. Shmuel says you can do what Reb Shimon Shazuri said, which means bring them all together, but for a different reason, not because of blending, because Shmuel, as we've said, does not paskin that you can blend and mix these kitnios, these beans, with me. But the reason why you can put them all together is because when you actually harvested that crop, they were all next year's produce, because he disagrees and says even with beans, you do not follow when they took root, but you follow when they are completed. The complete beans are all therefore in 1 year, and therefore put them all together. Even if they took root, some before Rosh Hashanah and some after Rosh Hashanah. You with me? So that's how these two statements come together, or three statements. We've got three statements. The first statement Shmuel says is when you have produce which took root prior to Rosh Hashanah, you've got other beans that took root after Rosh Hashanah, put them all together and take your Trumas and Maisros. Reb Shimon Shazuri says the reason why you can do that is because of the rule of Bilo, blending, mixing, which means when you take them, they will be in the right proportions. Shmuel said, we paskin like Reb Shimon Shazuri, bring them all together because they are all 1 year's crop. But it fits in beautifully with the second statement of Shmuel. And the second statement of Shmuel was lakol ein bilo. He paskins, you cannot mix, but I don't need to mix. They're all 1 year's produce. You with me? They all were nigmar. The beans were nigmar after Rosh Hashanah, and that's the crucial point, not when they took root. And what's the third statement? The third statement is beautiful, how this all ties in together. Hakol holech achagma pri. We do not follow when it took root. So if it took root prior to Rosh Hashanah, that's irrelevant. It's when they're finished. And as they were finished, as finished beans after Rosh Hashanah, even though they took root before Rosh Hashanah, they are considered next year's crop, and therefore I can take them all, place them all together, mix them as much as you like, but not because of the rule of mixing last year's crop and this year's crop, because Shmuel does not agree to that principle of Reb Shimon Shazuri. So it's interesting how you can paskin the same, but for different reasons. Reb Shimon Shazuri says put them all together because I allow you to mix the beans together. When you've mixed them so well, when you take your maisa, you're actually taking maisa from 2 years at once. Great, but you're not missing out, because you're actually within that group that you've taken of these beans. They will be in the right proportion. Shmuel says you can do that and place them all together for a different reason. His reason is because they will all be next year's crop, because when they actually took root is an irrelevance. So we have these three statements. Now the Gemara says the following. Do we need three statements of Shmuel to get this halacha across? You know, it's like, could you get away with just 1, 2, or in other words, you know, you often find this idea. If I had statement 1 and statement 2, I can therefore infer statement 3, and I don't need to say it. We often find with the rabbis, they're trying to keep their words to a minimum. And therefore, if I've got statement A and I've got statement B, can I infer statement C from it? Or is that impossible? That is what the Gemara is going to do now. Obviously, if I just had one out of these three statements, I'd be in trouble. So let's just remind ourselves, what are these three statements? The first one is you can, if they grew before, took root before, took root after Rosh Hashanah, doesn't matter, place them all in the middle and take your Trumas and Maisros. It's actually all next year's crop. Second statement, blending and mixing is fine with whiskey. It's fine with wine and maybe even beer. It's fine with liquids, in other words, but it's not fine with beans. Once it's a solid, I'm always worried that I actually won't mix them up well enough. Of course, with liquids, it's much easier to mix. All you need is a nice spoon and mix them up, assuming they're similar and you haven't got something different about the wines where they won't mix. But assuming they will mix, you can do that. And the third statement was that everything, when it comes to beans, everything depends on the final group, when they're plucked, when they're finished. That's what's important. Top of the next page. Top of the morning, top of the page, Yud Daled Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara, Utsricha. They are needed. Look at the top Rashi. Utsricha Hani Tlas de Shmuel. These three statements of Shmuel are needed. And what we mean, therefore, is if I only had one, I couldn't learn the other two. Yeah? Hani Tlas de Shmuel, which are dash halacha Reb Shimon Shazuri. 1. 2. Ula koil ein bila. You cannot have this mixing, blending, unless it's liquids. We do not allow it to mix because you may not mix well enough. And the final statement, hakol hoilech acha gma pri. It all depends, all types of vegetables, including these beans. The deadline is when you're going across a year, it's when they are plucked, when they are finished. Okay? Top line, utricha. We need all three statements. Why? Now, this we can work out. Ashminan halacha karab Shimon Shazuri. If Shmuel, the only statement he made out of these three was, I paskin, the halacha is like Reb Shimon Shazuri is in a Tana. Shmuel, the great Shmuel, and Amora, Premier Division Amora, he's saying we paskin like Reb Shimon Shazuri. If that's all he said, I could have made a big mistake. Hava Amina, I might have thought, Mishum de Kasava, it's because Shmuel holds Yesh Bila. What was the reason why Reb Shimon Shazuri allowed you to place the beans, which took root earlier, before Rosh Hashanah, together with beans, the same beans, that took root after Rosh Hashanah? Because when I mix them up, they're so small, Yesh Bila, the rule of mixing and blending applies to beans. That's what I would have thought. And I'd be wrong, because that's not true. You cannot utilize that mechanism. If you really had beans, which were from 1 year across beans and another year, and you really had them separate, you could not place them in the middle. It only so happens if they took root prior to Rosh Hashanah and root after Rosh Hashanah. That's not important because it's not the hashrosha which is important. It's when they're plucked, when they're finished. So if Shmuel had only said a statement, we paskin like Reb Shimon Shazuri, I would have made a mistake. And I would have thought the reason why he's paskin like Reb Shimon Shazuri, because he is of the opinion, as Reb Shimon Shazuri actually is, that blending applies to beans. Okay? So we cannot just have statement number one. Komash malon, that's why we need the second statement. Lakoil ein bila. Bila, mixing, blending, does not apply to everything other than liquids. So I need those two statements. True? Yes. Okay, what about in reverse? Could I have done this in reverse? Could I just have said, Viashmin and lakoil ein bila? If I would have thought that bila does not apply, just that statement on its own, hava amina, I would have thought that maybe he paskins like the Rabbonon. If lakoil ein bila, what would I have said? I might have said, have a look at the Rashi. Rabbonon svirale. What does Rabbonon hold? V'ein termi mimenu, because ein bila You can't mix. If I had produce which took root earlier before Rosh Hashanah and beans that took root after Rosh Hashanah, if I would say Ein Bila, I might have thought I can't place them all together. Says Rashi, Ve'ein termi mimenu, ve'ein lo takona. There's no takona. L'chodosh v'yoshen sheni. So if they got mixed up, there's nothing I can do about it. Ella im came termim olav mimokamachi. You'd have to go, if they did get mixed up, you'd have to go to produce beans that you knew were old produce, and then take other produce which you knew were new, and say, I'm taking my trumas and maisos from my certain new, if you're old beans, on that pile, include, yeah, you with me? The situation is this. What happens if you hold Ein Bila, some of your produce got mixed up? Imagine now you've actually got 20 bushels of these beans. 10 of the bushels got mixed up, 9, 1, yeah? And I've got other bushels of these, if that's the right term to use for beans, which are old and new. And I've got some which are mixed up. What am I meant to do? Kundram Shimon Shazuri, no problem, even if they got mixed up, because Yesh Bila, mixing works, and that's fine. According to the Chachamim, if Bila does not work, what will I have to do? I cannot be, I know I've got a mixture here, but when I take a part of them, I can't be sure the part is in the same proportion as how much they were, how they were mixed. With me? It's a 9-to-1 mix. But when I take one bushel out of that 10, I can't tell it's in the same proportion, 9-to-1. But I do know they're 9 bushels of old, 1 bushel of new beans. What I will have to do, I will have to go elsewhere to beans which I know are certainly old produce, and say I'm now taking from these old ones, and I'm including that mixture of my old beans which are in there. I can't see which are which, and when I take some of them, I can't tell which is what. But I know now, I know what my proportions are and my volumes are in the mixture. If I take from my old, I will take my old, and I'm saying I'm taking my truma and maisa, or let's say the maisa, from these old, but it's including, I know how much I've got there when I do my calculation, and I know I've got 9 in there, and I'm taking up from that 9. You with me? Or have I lost people here? And similarly with my new crop, I've got my new crop, with part of the new crop I know for sure has not got mixed. I will take some of that, and I will say, I'm taking my maisa on this new crop, plus also that proportion of new crop which is in that mixture. Because if I take anything from that mixture, I can't be sure I've got the right proportions, but I know how much is there in aggregate in total. That's what Rashi says. Elohim came to him from somewhere else. Lefi cheshbon, according to the calculation, mechodosh al chodosh, new on new, and from old, certain old, onto the old which is in the mixture. So, if I only mentioned this principle of Ein Bila, I would have thought that if they got mixed up together, imagine everything got mixed up together, there's nothing I can do, which is not the case, because the Shmuel Paskins, because they took root prior to Rosh Hashanah and they took root after Rosh Hashanah, I have got an option, because they are all classified as next year's crop, because taking root is immaterial. So you with me? So if all Shmuel has said would be Ein Bila, I would have thought there's no way out here, and that's not true, because we're paskening that it's not when they took root, but it's when you got the finished product. It turns out that when I've mixed produce, these beans took root before Rosh Hashanah, together with the beans that took root after Rosh Hashanah, They, in fact, are all from 1 year's crop. So telling me Ein Bila itself, I would have thought there's nothing I can do. And that's not true. Because, yeah, you with me? Because he holds, bit complicated, because he holds that it's not when they took root is important. I do have another option because they're all considered 1 year's crop, next year's crop. Okay, continue the Gemara. Ve'iyash me'inon, 3, 4, 5 lines down. I've got another, the third statement. If I only mentioned halacha 1 and halacha 2, one case is halacha like Reb Shimon Shazuri, and the second one is halacha that Ein Bila. What would, and I didn't have that third statement, I'd be finished. Why? Hava Amina, I would have thought, Kasha, the Shmuel, other Shmuel. I'm left with the contradiction. If all I've got is Reb Shimon Shazuri's halacha, which says you can place them all in the middle, and then I've got another halacha which tells me Ein Bila, I would have thought I can't place them all in the middle if I've only got those two statements without the third statement. Have a look at Rashi. Kasha de Shmuel ad Shmuel. Hacha Oma Shmuel alocha Reb Shimon. And it sounds like because Yesh Bila, V'hacha Oma Ein Bila. I've got a contradiction. You with me? If I did not have that third statement of Shmuel, I would have ended up with a contradiction in Shmuel. First of all, it's passing like Reb Shimon Shazuri, and we assume that means Yesh Bila. I can mix. And then I've got another statement, the second statement, which says Ein Bila, you can't mix. Therefore, I've got that final statement. Back to the Gemara again. Komash Malon, beginning of line is Ada Shmuel. Komash Malon, that's why we need Hakol Holech Acha Gemar Pri. That's why I need to tell me that everything follows the end of the product, not just when it took root. And therefore, he's telling me, when he says he paskins like Reb Shimon Shazuri, it's not because mixing is permitted or works. It's because it's all next year's crop. Have a look at Rashi. Komash malon hakol holech v'chulu lemeimra de kule chodoshu. He's paskening like Reb Shimon Shazuri that you can place them all in the middle, mix them up, and the reason is because it's all 1 year's crop. Reb Shimon v'la. He's paskening like Reb Shimon that you can place them all together, last year's crop and this year's crop. Reb Shimon Shazuri held it was last year's crop and this year's crop because part of it took root before Rosh Hashanah and part of it took root after Rosh Hashanah. He tells me you can place it all in the middle and mix and take your Trumas and Maasros in one go off for 2 years. Why? Because Yesh Bila, says Shmuel. Now that we got the third statement, he says, yes, I would say the same thing. Place them in the middle and take your Trumas and Maasros from them. But you're not taking from last year's crop and this year's crop. It's all this year's crop. Why? Because it doesn't follow Hashrosha when they took root, but because they were all harvested at the same time, they are all the new crop. With me? That's why we need the three statements. Continues the Gemara, one final piece. Ve'i ashmeinan hakol holech acha gemar pri. If you just would have said that statement, everything follows hakol holech acha gemar pri, that itself you might think means when you say hakol holech acha gemar, everything, this word hakol, what it really means is all vegetables. But I could make a mistake and think that hakol holech acha gemar pri, hava amina, I might have thought afila tvur v'zeisim. Even when we're talking, remember, we're talking about produce, which means corn, olives, wine. That's not true, because remember, we've got another principle for them. Their principle is a third of the growth. With me? It's only in regarding, yeah? If I only had the statement Hakol Holech Acha Gmar Pri, I might have thought right across the board, everything, including corn. And that's not true. Do you remember the rule we had before? When you're talking about corn, it's a third of the growth. If I have a third of the growth prior to Rosh Hashanah, a third of the growth after Rosh Hashanah, that's considered last year's crop and this year's crop. It's only when we're referring to beans or vegetables, says the Gemara, Kamash Malon, Halochi Rab Shimon Shazuri. The halacha is like Rab Shimon Shazuri only regarding these beans because they're in the group called vegetables. But my dapalig, with me? Now I've got you with me. Halacha Rab Shimon Shazuri, and Rab Shimon Shazuri was talking about beans. That's in that halacha. We don't follow before Rosh Hashanah and after Rosh Hashanah because everything follow. That's where Hakol Holech Acha Gmar Pri. You with me? But that does not apply to corn. Corn is off this discussion entirely. You with me? If I just would have said Hakol Holech Acha Gmar Pri, I might have thought the corn as well. It depends when they're plucked. Depends when you do the harvesting, and that's not true. Because when it comes to corn, it's a third of the growth prior to Rosh Hashanah. That qualifies as being last year's crop. And this really is the last piece. V'lashme'inan hani tarti. So let's just have two. Lakol ein bila lomali. Why can't we just have Hakol Holech Acha Gmar Pri? And the halachas like Reb Shimon Shazuri, if I place those two statements together, that I follow the ending, right? And I also paskin like Reb Shimon Shazuri, doesn't it work out automatically? The reason why I'm paskining like Reb Shimon Shazuri is because they're all considered 1 year's crop, which is next year's crop. Says the Gemara, why do I need to make the statement of Ein Bila? Says the Gemara, Lomli, Hokamashmanon de Layayin and the Shemen Yesh Bila. That second statement tells me something else. Although Ein Bila you cannot mix, and the reason why I'm placing them all together, the beans that took root prior to Rosh Hashanah, together with the beans that took root after Rosh Hashanah, nothing to do with Bila. It's because they're all considered 1 year's crop. Shmuel also needs to tell me that Ein Bila applies to everything bar, real bar here, bar the drinks, bar the wine and the oil, because when it comes to wine and oil, you can do mixing. So let's just confirm how we're learning here, because there's a full stop. Says the Gemara, we have three statements of Shmuel, and we paskin like Shmuel, which helps us, which means when it comes to fruits, what's crucial before or after Rosh Hashanah? Budding. We paskin like Shmuel, that when it comes to corn, it's whether a third of the growth took place prior to Rosh Hashanah. When it comes to vegetables, including these kidneys, including beans, it's when they're finished. It's the finished product, the full development, not a third of the growth, not when it took root. Shmuel is of the opinion that it is the finished product. So we end up with three categories: a third of the growth for corn, budding for fruit trees, and lekita, which actually means plucking or the finished product when it comes to vegetables, including beans. Second statement, Shmuel is of the opinion you cannot mix. If you really got them mixed up, and you imagine you kept a crop of beans from 1 year to the next, even though the year actually is when they were plucked. So imagine you had kidneys, these beans plucked one year and beans plucked another year, if they got mixed up, you'd have problems with that group, because we do not allow you to take from that group. So if your total produce got mixed up, you've got a problem. It's only if partial, but if they all got mixed up, you cannot take them because we don't allow blending except for liquids. And the final statement, which links to the first statement, was that we are not making a new category for beans, which is when they take roots. It falls into the general category of vegetables, all these Borapuri vegetables, including beans. What's important is when they are plucked or when they get to the end of their growth. And now the Gemara just adds an extra brisa as an asmachta. Now we've said before, when it comes to vegetables, including these beans, taking trumas and maisos are not min haTorah. Min haTorah, it's only on corn, on oil, and grapes. Everything else is midrabanan. Says the Gemara, Tanya, we've got a brisa. We can just start this today. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, remember the posuk in Devarim? We lay this on the last day of Pesach. Talks about Sukkos. Remember in the end of Re'eh, Kol HaBechor, the laning, those people who managed to be in shul, or those that just looked up the Chumash. It goes through the Yom Tovim in the end of Parshas Re'eh, and it talks about Sukkos, and it says, Chag HaSukkos Ta'aseh. You probably got the posuk around the side. It may be number 1 on the side of your Gemara. It's in mine, it's Aleph, depends which Gemara you've got. The attachment should have, is that right, Peter? Can we have a thumbs up from somebody who will tell me the posuk's on the side? Yes, it is number 1. Thank you. So the posuk says, Chag HaSukkos, the Yom Tov of Sukkos, Ta'aseh Lecha, make for yourself, Shivas Yomim, 7 days. But Osbecha, when you gather together, you gather Migornecha Umiyikvecha, from your Gornecha, normally the threshing floor, Umiyikvecha, normally that's the vats of the wines or the oil, yeah, Mikvecha. Funny, you've got the word from. You don't gather from there. You gather to put it le. It should be le gornecha. What's mi gornecha? Says the Gemara, that mem, it's a remez, it's a hint to tell me I've got 2 classifications here. I've got osbecha, when I'm gathering together my crop, and I've also got mi gornecha, from, I've got the items which are in my corn, which is in the threshing floor, and I've got my vats of oil, wine. I'm comparing osbecha to migornecha and mikvecha. Look at this Gemara. Ma gorem v'yekev miyuchodim. Now, we do know that min haTorah, when it comes to goren and yekev, that is min haTorah. You've got to take trumas and maisos. And if you remember, it was a hard piece of Gemara we had some time back. We worked out in min haTorah, you've got to wait for 1/3 of the growth. 1/3 of the growth happening prior to Rosh Hashanah, it's last year's crop. If you haven't got 1/3 of the growth by the time it gets to Rosh Hashanah, it means it will be next year's crop. Says the Gemara. What's the rule about goren and yekev, corn and oil? Miyuchodim, they are special in which way? Shegedelim al mei shona she'ovra. The irrigation, which is important for it, is what happened. Once you got to Rosh Hashanah, you've got 1/3 of the growth. It's really got sufficient, been irrigated sufficiently for it to grow fully now. That's why we are taking on the rule as long as it's got 1/3 of the growth. With me? Umis asrin l'shona she'ovra. Once it's got 1/3 of the growth, even though there may be plenty of rain in Tishri and Cheshvan, it is still classified as last year's crop. You'll tell me it's been irrigated as well. There was rainfall in Cheshvan and Tishri. That's immaterial because it's got to a third of the growth. Yes, it's true. The extra irrigation, of course, helps, but the main part of its growth came in that first third, and therefore it's last year's crop. Says the Gemara, Af kol shegedelim al mei shona she'ovra, misasrin l'shona she'ovra. Every item, things that grow, which depend on last year's irrigation, will be, the Trumas Maisa of them will also be similar to them, and they will be last year's crop. We'll explain this in a minute. Everything bar Eurocus, vegetables. Why? What's special about vegetables? Shegedelim al mei shona haba. The irrigation of vegetables is constant. If they get irrigated post Rosh Hashanah, they are still gaining immensely from that irrigation. And therefore, it will not be dependent on last year's, it's next year's crop. And therefore, when it comes to vegetables, you consider the end of the year when they're plucked, because every moment they are in the ground, they are nourished, taking great nourishment from the irrigation. And therefore, misasrin l'shona haba. Have a look at the Rashi here. Have you got it? Mikan, says the Gemara, this is the view of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Somchu chachomim, the rabbis relied, soimech, because it is only midrabanan, likbaya, to fix zaman maase yerek, the time for taking maase on vegetables, de divrayim, which is according to their words, which what Rashi means here is it's only midrabanan. Acha lekita, it follows when they are actually plucked. Vegetables, plucking. In fact, the same idea we said it to Shmuel, the same would apply to these kidneys, the beans too. It's when they're a finished product. Have you got it? The Rashi there, beginning Yerek. Just under halfway down the page. De divrayim acha lekita la asmachta ba'alma. Asmachta means something to hang on. This posuk, they are utilizing this posuk as an asmachta. It's not midrash Torah. You don't have to take trumas and maisas for vegetables. They are relying on this posuk from Re'eh as an asmachta ba'alma. What does it mean? Kol osif shelcha. So ba'ospecha means your gatherings. All your gatherings, which means all your harvests, yahei ketrumas goren v'yekev. They should be similar to your gatherings or your harvesting of corn and of oil. Again, sheholcha bohen Torah, where the Torah follows, achashona, according to the year, sheheviu shlish, where a third of the produce has come through. That's the crucial dependency, is that and where you're going across a year. Hare sheholcha bohen achas shona, we are following the year, shegodlu b'mei meha. If you're following only a third of the growth and it rains subsequently, you may tell me a huge amount of irrigation happened afterwards. It's not important to us. It's a third, it's the first third, which is crucial. And it's when they got the irrigation, the water, the consumption that came from that, says Rashi, shegodlu b'mei meha, shehavois shlish shelohen, the coming of a third, beginning of line is shlish shelohen, he g'dei loson, that's its main growth. Sheme'oisa shah, from that time onwards, ru'uyin likotze b'doicha. In fact, you could actually cut it down It will be small, but that's considered now sufficient. Anything more is extra growth. But the main growth it got was from its first third of this nourishment. Next Rashi, 2 more Rashis to go, we'll stop. Afkol, similarly all cases. Therefore, what about when it comes to trees? Trees is midrabanan. What's important when it comes to, of course, to the Yom Tov, the Rosh Hashanah for trees is Tu B'Shvat, but what has to happen by Tu B'Shvat? When it starts to bud. So you'll tell me, why is budding so important? So we've got this apple, it's got to be a large apple. Maybe there'll be further irrigation. It's the budding which is important. Shekol gedelas. Now, those people who are familiar with the growth of apples will be able to confirm this, hopefully. Shekol gedelas peiroisov, the growth of their fruits. Al yedei she'ala saraf. It's got the sap in them, in the tree. Saraf or ilan, this word saraf. Lifnei chanotahu. Wow, what an important lesson. Talking about these rabbis being experts on botanical matters too. What they're telling us is, perhaps Peter could use the, yeah, good, thank you. What we're saying, the same thing with trees. Once it's got to its budding, which happened prior to its Rosh Hashanah, which is Tu B'Shvat, the sap and the irrigation that took place prior to that is now in the tree, and any further development of that fruit very much depends on the irrigation that it had prior to that budding. Interesting. Whereas when it comes to vegetables, the last Rashi, Yotsu Yerokos, this comes to exclude vegetables. Shegedelim al meishona habor. No, it's not finished. When it comes to vegetables, every little bit of water and irrigation they get helps. As opposed to the trees, extra irrigation past the budding, not that important to it because it's already got the sap from the previous year. That's not the same with vegetables. Vahainu shnas likitoson, when they're actually plucked, sharei goizes in oisa, when you cut it, hichozeres in gedela. You cut down tomatoes, you'll get further growth. If there's further irrigation, every small amount of water that comes through irrigation helps the growth of the vegetables. So with that, we'll finish today, which is the following. We're learning from here an asmachta. The rabbi said, it looks like, as we've got this idea of the third when it comes to corn, why is a third so important? Once it's got to a third, it's got the bulk of its development. Any further development is extra, nice, not crucial. In fact, you could even cut it prior to that, and it would be possible to eat that corn. Same with trees. Once it's got the sap, once it's got to the budding stage, the sap is in the tree, it's last year's produce. When it comes to vegetables, it's not sap, it's not last year's produce until the end of the plucking. Because until that time that they're plucked, they are still getting their nourishment from the ground, as opposed to the trees, which the bulk of its nourishment it's already got. That's not the same when it comes to vegetables, and therefore the rabbis, based on this principle, said it's nourishment which we want to determine the Yom Tov. Not the Yom Tov, the Yom Tov, the Rosh Hashanah, and therefore, if it's got its plucking prior to Rosh Hashanah, it's last year's crop. If the plucking is post Rosh Hashanah, even though the bulk of it, 90% of the growth took place prior to Rosh Hashanah, that's not important because it could still be nourished further with extra irrigation. And with that, we'll stop on this Gemara. I will, however, turn to Peter. If we can now go back to Sefaria. Let's just pick up another posuk in Tehillim. I did hear, actually, I spoke to Anthony. I tried to contact him today, couldn't get hold, but I did speak to him last week. if we pick up the Tanakh, and he did say that his wife was getting a bit stronger, so let's hope that continues. Tehillim come down to a bit further down the writings. I think you'll have to scroll up a bit. Go to Psalms, please. Go to Psalm, yes, 146. Look at that second pasuk. Ahallo Hashem b'chai, of course it's Psukkah de Zimra. I will praise the Lord all my life. B'chayai, Azamra, I will sing hymns. Azamra, it's actually more than, normally Azamra means with instruments too. I think you'll find that the Meforshim explain, singing hymns, but we're singing with instruments. So, okay, what's this ba'oidi? Whilst I exist. What does it mean, whilst I exist? B'chayoi, all my life. Ba'oidi, while I exist. Okay, so you could say, if you ba'oidi, whilst I exist, have a look if you can at the commentary. Go down to the Malbim. Now, we have to take this in Hebrew. I'm afraid there's no translation here. Even if you press that, that's fine. It's okay, we can read this. I'm only going to pick up the first couple of lines. Beautiful pshat from the Malbim. Zoom in, thank you very much. Oh, very good. The Malbim translate this differently. Ahalo Hashem b'chayai, Hillel echod al hachayim. Praise, one type of praise, Hillel echod al hachayim, for life itself. I will thank you, Hashem, for life. What's this ba'oidi? Now, the translation says, while I exist, but let's see what the Malbim does with this. Azamro lelokai ba'oidi, va'oid azamer. Furthermore, I will, zemer, normally taken, I will sing, not just a hallel as a song, not just praise, I'm going to be singing here, normally with instruments, but look what he does with this. Al ha'oid v'ha'yisoroin shenosan li chutz min ha'chayim. Wow. This word oid, my father is very keen on this Malbim. In other words, the first part of the pasuk says, I'm thanking you, Hashem, for life, but I'm singing hymns to you, ba'oidi, for the extras. The extras that I've got, not just life. It could be the extras. Every person has this extra dimension. The qualities that person has, whatever the area is that person is, the real emphasis of that individual, whatever area it happens to be, I'm thanking you for that. The oid and the yisorid, besides just life, all the extras. So it could be the extras that surround me in life, but more than that, it means the extras, the extra characteristics that I've got. Like the orchestra, every member of the orchestra, specialist at their particular area. Similarly, we're saying the same thing here. Azamra lelokai, I will sing praises to God. Wonderful. Azama, with that oid and that yisorim that I've got, that's what we've got to utilize. The long piece, we don't need the rest. I say just to conclude that. So going back now, we might as well see each other. Very powerful message. The message, therefore, from that pasuk is, I will thank you, Hashem, for life, but I will sing praises with the extra characteristics that I've got, my specialism, if you like. I'm going to utilize it. Rather than it should be latent, just potential, we've got to utilize, every person needs to be looking at their own particular area, that they can act as a specialist and an expert. They've got to use that as Zamro, a beautiful Malbim, as Zamro lelokai. I'm going to sing praises with instruments, singing praises, which means utilizing the extras that I've got, my speciality, And that, of course, is something we work on, what actually is our specialism. But whatever it is, we need to be working on that. And when I say working on it, praising God with it, which means what? Utilizing it. Utilizing for the benefit of other people, for other individuals, and making sure that it's being used to its full. And in that way, azamra lelokai ba'oidi, with that oid yisorim, with that extra, make sure it's being one's praising God with it, utilizing it to the full. With that, gentlemen, I leave you for tonight. I wish you well. We got Michael with us as well now. Good to see you, Michael. And Sam.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Good. And Malcolm. Well, and hopefully you had a beautiful Yom Tov, different Yom Tov maybe than previous years, but nevertheless, Yom Tov, a beautiful Yom Tov. And in Mitzvah Hashem, let's go from strength to strength. It looks like things are progressing. Mitzvah Hashem, let's hope we do move on, further progression there. People being well, remaining well, people being topped up with their vaccinations, those that have had one or onto two.